In this video, I will demonstrate 5 ways of using Waves plugins with the Avid S3L. Depending on the equipment you have available, some of the configurations I demonstrate should be possible for you too. Many of you watching this will be hoping that I will show how to run Waves plugins directly on the S3L console. Unfortunately, this is not possible as Waves never produced an appropriate plugin to accomplish this task. I will, however, demonstrate the next best options available. The first configuration will demonstrate hardware inserts. It requires only an audio interface with 2 or more channels and a Mac or Windows machine to host the Waves plugins. The audio interface will be configured as an insert on the E3 engine, just like an external audio gear. This configuration most closely matches how effects were added via inserts on the main bus of analog consoles. The second configuration will demonstrate analog Fx Returns. It requires an audio interface and a Mac or Windows to host the Waves plugins. Audio will be sent out the stage 16 outputs to the audio interface for processing, and then return signals will be routed via inputs on the stage 16. This configuration provides several channels for Waves processing, but is limited on available hardware I/O. The third configuration will demonstrate AVB Fx Returns. It requires an AVB-capable Mac to host the Waves plugins, and an AVB-capable Ethernet interface. Audio signals will be routed to the Mac via AVB, processed in Waves, and returned to the S3L for final processing. This configuration provides several channels for Waves processing and is the most versatile of the 3 configurations. The fourth configuration will demonstrate processing signals with a Waves impact server by converting them from AVB to MADI and finally to SoundGrid using multiple audio interfaces. Audio signals will be routed to and from SoundGrid directly, with the computer being used to configure the plugins. This is the most powerful configuration with the lowest latency, but also the most expensive. There are several criteria against which each configuration will be evaluated: cost, setup complexity, runtime complexity, latency I, and portability. For cost, I'll list what extra hardware is required to make the configuration work. I'll use current prices for the hardware I demonstrated with. Setup complexity looks at how difficult it is to set up the configuration the first time, and how difficult it is to maintain as an audio engineer. Runtime complexity looks at how difficult it is to use and troubleshoot the configuration. Latency provides an idea of how much end-to-end latency is introduced. Portability looks at how easy it is to transport this configuration for situations where you need to travel. I will cover how I determine the latency with SMART at the end of the video. In the first configuration, I will demonstrate hardware inserts. This configuration allows for effects as inserts on up to 8 mono or 4 stereo channels, depending on channel availability on the E3 engine and the capabilities of your audio interface. For those who've used analog consoles, this configuration would be similar to using inserts on groups or on the main outs. Some common analog use cases would include EQing, compression and gating, master bus compression, or loudness measurements. In this demonstration, I'll be using a MacBook Pro 13-inch 2020, along with a HOWTO Ultralight Mark III hybrid interface. It's this one up here. I've patched the analog outputs of the E3 engine to the line inputs of the HOWTO, channels 3 through 6, and the line outputs of the HOWTO, channels 1 through 4, to the analog inputs of the E3. To start, let me play a short jam session from the band at ICF. They like to just play around after the celebration, and I record that. It's quite fun. It's nothing special, it's just material. For sake of demo, though, let's say I'd like to add a master bus compression to this, and as well some effects on the snare drum and on the acoustic guitar. So that's what we'll demo today. I'll be using Waves Super Rack to manage the plugins. If you've ever looked at the Super Rack manual, you're going to recognize that the configuration I'm demonstrating here is very similar to the one on page 4 of the manual. So let me get the stuff started. And I've got a bit of music. I don't want it too loud here. Let's go over to Venue. Here we can see that the signals are coming in. First thing I want to do is add some master bus compression. Grab the left channel. Let's go ahead and patch the inserts. And I'm going to use left and right, the analog 1 and 2 on the E3 engine. Now you're going to notice as soon as I did that, the music stopped. I don't know if you can see it or not. Up here on the interface, it is still, I'm getting the signal through, but because I haven't started Wave Super Rack on the laptop yet, there's no audio routing. So let me go ahead and start Super Rack. Check the patching first off. I've already got the Mo2 patched, so that's good. Let's come over here to the first rack. I'm going to set my input as channels 3 and 4. Those are the first line inputs on my Mo2. It automatically patched outputs to channels 1 and 2, which is quite nice. And you hear I now have signal coming through. And over on Venue as well, you can see that the signal is present. Come back here. Let's go ahead and add the bus compression. So, add plugin. I want to use the SSL compressor just because, and I choose the crystallography stereo finalizer. All right, the first thing I'm going to check, I'll turn it up here a bit so I can hear it. First thing I will check are levels. It's a little bit quieter when the compressor is in. So what I can do is take it down just a bit on the input and up just a bit on the output. Still there a bit. But as you can see, I've got a bus compressor in. Obviously, I can now, over in Venue, enable that or disable it by turning on or off the hardware insert. I've got a bus compression. Let me stop the stuff and restart it. I'd like to add a Hall effect on the snare and acoustic guitar now. So I'm gonna come over here to the outputs. I went ahead and set up a demo group here. It's a stereo group. On the inserts, this will be routed out to left-right. I'm going to patch that to 3 and 4. Now this time you didn't hear anything change, but if you notice there's no signal coming through, well, maybe I need to patch. So let's go patch. Get my inputs. I'm going to put my snare and my acoustic guitar. I'm going to throw them in the same reverb, doesn't matter. Output. Also need to pick that, and that. Set the output to 0. And come on, why do I not have any signal? Oh, I have no signal because I've already patched it. Okay, so turn that on. Same thing back over on Venue. On Super Rack. Let's come to rack number 2. Inputs 5 and 6. Output to 3 and 4. And on Venue, you now see I've got signal going through. Let's add a plugin. Plugin list. Reverb. I want the Abbey Road plates. And immediately you begin to hear the room noise, or the plate. Let me solo. I don't know if you could hear that there. Actually, you won't hear it because of how I have it routed. But the Hall effect is coming through, and just let you listen here for a bit. Later on, I'm going to be measuring the delay, and just so that we have an idea of what the delay, full propagation delay through this entire setup is, starting from the signal I generate through my audio interface, waves, processing, all the way back. I need to give you as a viewer an idea of how much latency you can expect to deal with. So this was a demonstration of hardware inserts. The next configuration demonstrates analog FX returns. This configuration is similar to the previous hardware inserts configuration in the use of an audio interface to bring signals into a computer, but it differs in that it is limited only by the available channel count on the S3L and on the audio interface. For those who've used analog consoles, this configuration is similar to sending signals via group or aux outputs to external equipment and returning the process signals as inputs to the board. Common use cases include EQing, compression and gating, reverbs or delays, and sound system measurements. I'm going to start with the drum compression. For this, I'm going to need an output channel. I've already configured an output channel for the drum. This would be groups 1 and 2, and I need to patch everything into that group. So actually, let me come here to the group, multi-assign, pick my inputs. I'm just assigning everything to make it simple. Outputs, I've got my multi-assign. There's all my drum channels. I need to send that, I'll need to patch that. So in the patch bay, I've already patched that drum group. I'm going to send that out analog 1 and 2. The additional thing I need to do is make sure that I'm giving a signal out to that drum group. Right now it's off, so let me go ahead and pick all those again. Got them picked. Turn that on, set that to 0. I'm not going to use pre, as I want to follow the mix on the faders. And now I should be able to, I've got it patched, I've got signals going out to it. Let me go ahead and do the snare next. For the snare, I'm going to send it out a direct, and I've got snare top and snare bottom. Yeah, both of them are going out stage 2, analog 3 and 4. So if I come here to stage 2, outputs 3 is the snare direct and 4, and you'll see I've already patched the acoustic guitar as well. So as far as venue is concerned, for the outputs, things are patched. Now let's look at the inputs. I've set up 3 channels over here. I've got a drum compression channel, a snare hall channel, and an acoustic guitar hall. Let me go ahead and patch those inputs. Come over here to patch bay, inputs, stage 2. Those are going to come in, basically 9 through 16 is what I have patched on my Motu. So I'll scroll down here to drum compression, should be on channels 9 and 10, snare hall, and acoustic guitar hall. Let me go ahead and send some signal now. Make sure I'm getting something here. I've got the signal here. Let's come over to Super Rack. I'll stop this. On Super Rack, I'm going to set up 3 racks. The first rack, hey, I can name these. Just call it drum compression. Plug in here, dynamics. Before I do the plug-in, I'm actually wanting to patch the inputs stereo. We're going to do 1 and 2, and it patched out 1 and 2. How does that? If I play, that's working. And now let's go over to rack 2. This will be 3 and 4. And that's working. And finally 5 and 6. That's working. It's a mono. So actually let me unpatch 5 and 6 because I did stereo because I was in the habit of it. I'll unpatch that, and I'm going to repatch the input as a mono 5, but I will leave it as a stereo 5 and 6 out because the reverb probably will give me a nice stereo effect. Okay, back to rack 1, the drum comp. I'm going to add a plug-in. Here I'd like the API 2500. the one I'm choosing. You're welcome to choose whatever you want. And I'm going to choose the heavy kit compression. Am I getting anything out of it? It's doing a little bit. Obviously, my drum set is not the loudest, but we'll come over here to the inputs and see on the drum compression we are getting something here. If I solo it, I would hear that, but you wouldn't, so I won't bother soloing it. But one thing I need to do now is hit the left-right. Right now this is not patched out the left-right, so let's turn that on. And get my faders. So you can at least hear that, it's there. One thing you might notice if you're listening closely, it almost sounds like the snare is doubled. That has to do with the latency of this whole setup. This is one of the things to be careful about. So let's go ahead and check the latency of this particular plugin. It's set at 0, but as I've, the latency on the HOWTO, if I remember correctly, the latency of the HOWTO, in this case the HOWTO A28 via USB, is 20 milliseconds at 48 kilohertz, which is what I'm running. So you probably heard it there. Let me go ahead and bump this up to 96 kilohertz so that I have a latency of 14 milliseconds instead of 20. Setup, separate 96. All right, we'll start this over and listen to the difference. To me, it sounds much better. I'll go ahead and drop it back to 48 kilohertz just so you hear that difference. So if you can hear closely, there's this slight. So again, just pay attention to it in your setup. I'll move my HOWTO back to 96. Still ever so slightly there, but you gotta have a much better ear now to hear it. Okay, we've got a drum compression. You've seen how that was set up. Obviously you can patch it however you need. I'm gonna call this good for now because I really don't want to mess with it further. So stop the music. The next one I'm going to do is the snare hall. For this, I've got, just to check, got the signal returning in. That's grand. And let's come over to over here on Super Rack. I've got a snare hall. Go to my overview. Let's actually go to the rack. Plugin list. I should have planned this a bit earlier. I'm going to get a plate. Plate sounds good. And come down here to drum. Let's just do a drum room. Okay. And over here, again on venue, I need to make sure I'm patching this over to the left-right. So I'm not sure where this, I've got a gain already set here. I'm not sure where that's going to come in. We'll see. It works. So here's pulling the hull out. Here's bringing it back. The next configuration demonstrates AVB Fx Returns. This configuration is similar to the previous analog Fx Returns in that the signals will be processed inside the S3L, but it differs in that all of the signals will flow over Ethernet using the AVB protocol rather than through an external audio interface. Although I will demonstrate the usage of waves, I won't demonstrate AVB in depth. If you'd like to know more about using AVB with the S3L, please see my previous videos. I will note that no changes to your E3 engine are required for this particular configuration to work. For sake of simplicity, I will demonstrate the same setup as with the previous analog FX returns configuration. Okay, we're back here. I have plugged in my laptop so that it's, I've connected it via Ethernet to my AVB network. And other than that, I haven't touched any routing yet. Everything is still plugged in via the HOWTO and analog. I'll show you just walking through it as I change things so that you can see that it's working. First things first, over on my laptop, I need to configure the venue, or the E3 engine, so that my laptop sees the E3 engine. So in this case, for those of you who've watched my previous AVB videos, in this case, you do not need to make any changes to your device, to your E3 engine for this particular demonstration to work. So first start over here in audio MIDI setup on my Mac, and you'll notice I don't have the E3 engine. I have a bunch of other audio devices, but I don't have the E3 engine. So I'm going to hit Command 3, well I would hit Command 3, but I'm going to show the network device browser. Here you see my various engines or AVB devices. In this case, for those of you who have not modified your E3 engine, it's going to just be this plain one here. Well, that was interesting. It's just going to be this plain one here, no parentheses. And if any of you are wondering why there's a stage 16 here, I've also modified my stage 16 so I can use it as a direct audio device, but I won't cover that in this video. Now that I've connected my E3 engine, it shows up down here. I'm just going to leave that, and I'm going to come over to Super Rack. Let's bring it over here. Setup. And the device does show up in Super Rack already. Let's go ahead and choose that. Now, with the setup that we have on Venue, you can see on my options and devices, I have 2 stage racks connected. And on stage 2, the lower sets of inputs, 9 through 16, are what I was using previously with the HOWTO, and the outputs I was using here. We're not going to use those now, but I'm going to take the inputs directly from the stage, and we're going to fake the outputs. So we'll do that with the Pro Tools channels. Let's start over here on the drum group that I did earlier. And rather than patching it, if I come over here to the patch bay, rather than patching it out stage 2, just to be good, let me go ahead and clear out all of my outputs and directs so that they don't work, as well as the inputs from stage 2. I want to make sure those are not working. So for the outputs, I'm going to come over here to Pro Tools. So I'm randomly going to choose, it may be hard to see, but these gray, these are free channels. So I'm going to choose 31 and 32 for the drum group. On the directs, again, Pro Tools, I'm going to choose 35 for the snare top and 36 for the snare bottom. Those are my outputs. For my inputs, let's come over inputs, Pro Tools. These same ones are free. For my drum, keys, vocal, reverb, where are those? There we go. Drum compression. It's 33, 34, snare hall, 35 and 36. We should be able to go and play. Let's go and just see if this works. How about we? On the outputs, we know if I play some music, group 2 is sending out. And we'll come back to my inputs. And let's start troubleshooting. So far I've got no signal. Obviously I don't, because I haven't done the patching over here in Super Rack. I still have, if I look at the first track, I still have the plugins loaded from last time. Come down here to my audio device and choose the E3 engine, which I previously patched. Sample rate 48 kilohertz. I can't do anything about that. That's what the S3L is running at. So come to my rack inputs. As we saw in Venue earlier, we're going to choose 3334 for the drum compression, and it matched over here on the output. And on the snare hall, we're going to choose inputs 35 and 36. And it matched over there. So let's go ahead and play some signal. And we see that on both the drum compression and on the hall, we're getting signal back in. So I can, there's my snare hall. That's my drum compression. So as you see now, I'm not using an external audio device. And it's working quite well. I'll update you at the end of the video with what the latency is. I haven't tested the latency here yet, but I'll update you at the end of the video with latency. Okay. The final configuration demonstrates AVB, MADI, and SoundGrid Fx Returns. This configuration is similar to the previous AVB Fx Returns configuration in how signals will be processed, but it differs in that I'm going to use a MOTO M64 along with a DigiGrid MGO interface to bring the signals directly into my SoundGrid network and process them with a Waves impact server. I'll show the patching that I used with the MOTO unit, but I won't go into depth as to how to get the MOTO to work with the E3 engine. If you want to see that, you'll need to watch one of my other videos. For sake of simplicity, I will demonstrate the same setup as with the analog Fx Returns and the AVB Fx Returns. I'll start by patching the MOTO M64 device. For simplicity, I'm going to patch all 64 channels from the S3L as inputs to the M64, and all 64 outputs from the M64 as inputs to the S3L. So on the laptop, let's go ahead and open terminal. AVB util, controller. I'm going to open window the connection matrix. And what you'll see is I've already done the patching. All of the outputs of the E3 engine are patched into the inputs of the M64. That's these here. And then all of the outputs of the M64 are going back into the E3 engine. For sake of simplicity, I'm just patching all of them. Let's go look at the MOTO now. You'll see the sample rate is 48 kilohertz, matches the S3L. Everything's pretty default. I am using the optical MADI outputs, and I've got it configured for 64 outputs. Let's come into my routing. You're going to see that, let me blow that up a bit. You'll see that I've got all of the E3 engine outputs. They are mapped directly to the optical MADI. And then I have the same, the optical MADI as inputs. They all get mapped back to the AVB stream, which, as I showed earlier, is patched to the E3 engine. So this will take all of the AVB signals, route them straight to MADI into the, and therefore into SoundGrid. Both the M64 and the MGO are connected to my AVB network, as is my laptop. Unlike the previous demonstration, the laptop does not need to be AVB compatible. It doesn't need that Ethernet connection because we're not going to route any AVB signals to the laptop itself. As before, I will use AVB channels 33 and 34 for the drum compression, and 35 and 36 for the snare. So over here in Venue, let's come to the patch bay. You're going to see that my outputs, I've patched 33 and 34. I've left it from the same one. But 33, 34 are going out to Pro Tools, which is AVB. And then I have my snare directs, they're still connected 35, 36. And then as far as inputs are concerned, over here on Pro Tools, I have the drum compression return, 33, 34, and then I have the snare hall, 35, 36. As I've done a one-to-one patching between AVB and MADI, I'll be able to use the same channel numbers on MADI as on AVB. So let's go to SoundGrid, to the Super Rack. We're running Super Rack SoundGrid this time. In my setup, I'm going to add my MGO. And then I will also add my impact server. And you see both of those are working okay. I don't understand why the link lists as down. I consider it a bug because this will still work. In my overview, my racks, again, 33, 34 for my inputs for the drum compression, 35, 36 for the snare, the outputs match, and we are now ready to route some audio. Over here, in Venue, you can see I'm getting signal on both my drum compression and on my snare hall. I've not mixed those in yet. You see the fader is down. So I'm going to start with the drum compression. Again, I've changed no settings from last time. Bring some drum compression in. If you've got a really good ear, you may be able to hear the latency. If you listen to the snare, it's almost like the snare is doubled. This is one of the challenges with running these plugins outside of the S3L console. The latency is enough that you may be able to hear it. So for certain plugins like the compression, it may just not work for you. I'll go ahead and take that down and bring in the snare hall instead. So you hear that the hall works. Plugins like the hall, reverbs, delays, those tend to work. Or if you've got compression where you don't have transients, where the transient is very noticeable because of the latency, then you can easily make use of this configuration. Okay. I'd like to quickly cover how I'm measuring the latency of the various environments that I'm demoing. I'm going to use some software called Smart. Smart is the software I use for doing time alignment of arrays to subs. I also use it whenever I'm doing in-ear monitoring. Sorry, I just ate. I use it whenever I'm doing in-ear monitoring because that allows me to see visually the mix that I'm listening to in my ear. That way, if there's a frequency or something that stands out, I can identify it very quickly. I should train my ears, but I haven't. Let's jump in really quick. Oh, the basic setup, for those who don't know Smart, you run basically two mixes. You generate pink noise or a sweep with Smart. You send that out your audio interface. One of it loops immediately back in so that you can measure, you'll treat that as the base signal, and the other signal will go out through whatever device, or in this case, it's going to be the E3 engine, and it will come back in. And that way I can get a comparison of what the latency induced is by the engine as compared to just a baseline latency. Let's go ahead and make this happen. I've got it wired up already. I'll go over here into my transfer function. Right now you can see the base. Actually, let me turn on my peak noise. You can see the base latency of the interface by itself is 2.57 milliseconds. So the MOTO just by itself induces that. And if I come over here to venue, I have it coming in on, not a media, I have it coming in over here on this channel. It's coming in the analog input just like it was for the inserts, and I'm just sending it back out to left right. If I look at the patch bay on the engine, you can see here the input is on the analog input, the output is on the analog output. So what I'm going to do now is switch in the hardware insert. This basically is running out analog 2, and what this is showing is how much latency will be induced when the signal runs out the analog, or sorry, out the insert. I already have configured over on my laptop. I've got Super Rack. Where did it go? There it is. Come over to Overview and Rack. What I have is a plugin. Let me turn it off for now. You can see there's no signal coming in. Let me enable the hardware insert. I now have signal over here. Again, the plugin is not currently in. And if I look, the latency has increased from 2.5 milliseconds up to 11.3 milliseconds. Something to note, I'm running at 96 kilohertz. If I come look at the setup, this is at 96 kilohertz. If I drop this down to 48 kilohertz, wait here a bit, there it is. Come back to my rack, yeah, everything looks good. Back here in Smart, you see it's gone from 11 milliseconds to 17. So the frequency that you choose will have an impact on how much latency that you're dealing with. I've been running normally at 48 kilohertz with this MOTO, because for whatever reason I was getting some audio tearing last time I tried it. Maybe it was just the day, but so today when I was doing my testing, or the video, it was 48 kilohertz. So that's grand. One thing to note is up here on the Q4, I can enable it, and you hear that it changed. And over here in Smart, you see the waveform matches kind of what I had there in the Q4. The latency didn't change though. This is one of the nice things about waves. If I drop down here, you see the latency, additional latency induced by this particular plugin is 0 milliseconds. Let's see, if I add, for the fun of it, a dynamics, and I want the ultra maximizer. If I remember correctly, that one has additional latency. So let's go look. And you see there's the additional latency, the 80 milliseconds. It's pretty much exactly 80 milliseconds that showed up right there. So you do have to be careful which plugin you're using because of the latency that will be induced. But if you're using waves already, then you're most likely aware of that. So that was a quick thing. I will write down these numbers, and then as I go through the various settings, I'll record these numbers and show them to you. I'll now go through a quick evaluation of all the options. I'll list some pros and cons and evaluate each configuration according to setup complexity, runtime complexity, portability, latency, and cost. All of the factors are rated on a scale from 1 to 5, and absolute numbers are listed for cost and latency. For cost, I'll include prices in the US from B&H and Sweetwater, and from Thomann in Europe. For all of the demonstrations, I used a MacBook Pro 13-inch 2020 laptop with a 2.3 GHz quad-core Intel Core i7 CPU and 32 gigs of RAM. I also used Wave's Super Rack, which costs $599 US. It should be possible with the SoundGrid Studio free as an alternative for up to 8 channels. Hardware inserts are probably the easiest to set up and use, as they most closely replicate what one would do on an analog console. It even works with Windows PCs. Unfortunately, they are severely limited by how many channels are available. If you already have a small audio interface like the Motu Ultralight Mark III hybrid, this solution makes a great way to start using Waves plugins. The solution has low complexity, is easily portable, and the cost is reasonable. When used carefully, latency shouldn't be an issue. The next best solution for ease of use and the wide range of support options are Analog Fx Returns. Limitations are similar to the hardware inserts, but more I/O is possible. Personally, I find the combination of hardware inserts and Analog Fx Returns to be a great solution. Complexity is slightly higher with Analog Fx Returns as it requires additional patching and additional channels on the console. Latency is also a bit higher, but still reasonable for the right use cases. Cost is technically no different, although the configuration I demonstrated was slightly more expensive. I could have reused the Motu Ultralight Mark III, but I wanted to provide you, the audience, with options. The power begins to appear with the AVB Fx Returns configuration. This solution requires no extra hardware, besides a computer, no physical I/O, and no configuration changes are required on the E3 engine. Latency is reasonable, but this solution only works with a macOS computer and an AVB-capable Ethernet adapter. Overall, I consider the complexity of the solution to be medium, as the AVB configuration is a bit complicated. It is balanced by not needing physical I/O. The solution is extremely portable and cost-effective, and provides decent latency. I didn't show this in the video, but I also tried using SuperRack's SoundGrid with this configuration. Unfortunately, latency was way too high at 85 milliseconds to be even remotely useful. If cost is not an issue for you, or if low latency is important, then the final SoundGrid Fx Returns configuration is for you. The solution provides an incredibly low latency of 3 milliseconds end-to-end, a value that surprised me when I was doing my testing. This solution unfortunately requires changing the AVB configuration of your E3 engine, but this is a one-time change. It also requires expensive audio hardware and is quite complex to set up. For these reasons, I've rated both setup complexity and runtime complexity as a 5. The solution is the least portable of all the solutions, but still within reason. The low latency comes at a cost though. My personal solution cost me nearly 3,000 euros, but is worth it when I need Waves. In summary, hardware inserts and Analog Fx Returns are probably the easiest configurations for most people to get started with. They're highly portable, and most of you probably already have an audio interface to wire up. For those more daring, the AVB Fx Returns provide more power, but come with some increased complexity. If you are comfortable using Pro Tools with your S3L console, then I'd recommend that you at least try this configuration. If you need extremely low latency and cost is not an issue, then the SoundGrid Fx Returns configuration is the best of the bunch. Although complex to get going for the first time, once you are familiar with it, you'll be able to greatly enhance the power of your S3L. In closing, I want to thank you for watching this video. I hope that one or more of the solutions I've demonstrated have helped you in some way. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment. If you have any suggestions for future videos, leave them in the comments too. I'll leave links to all of the products I demonstrated in the description below, as well as a link to the script I used while preparing this video. Until next time.